All right, so welcome everyone. We are going to begin. I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Savvas Kazazis, a research associate at the School of Music Studies at Aristotle University. Dr. Kazazis will be speaking on the topic of triggering misophonia. And I do want to mention for everyone who is in the audience that there may be some sounds played during the presentation that you may find triggering. Dr. Kazazis, if you could just warn everyone before you play them, and perhaps individuals who don't want to hear those sounds can mute themselves or mute their microphone.
Yeah,
With that,
I'll do that. Yeah,
okay, wonderful. All right, well, please go ahead.
thanks. Well, thanks very much for having me. Um, I'll be presenting a paper that was published early this year, um, triggering misophonia, the importance of spectral information, temporal information, and action identification. And I'll explain later on what these things are. So what we know already from Misophonia, actually we know a lot more about it, but I'm just focusing on some stuff that are related to our research. So we do know that misophonia is an auditory disorder, and we know that because some parts of our brains respond strongly to misophonic sounds, at least for people that are actually misophonics compared to other people that are not. And this is done, by studying the brain structures or our auditory systems, so on and so forth. And that would be perfect, especially in my case, since I'm more into signal processing, let's say treating misophonia, we could focus on sound source separation, have machines that filter some sounds are out or masking them. But then some other research is pointing us to the fact that misophonia is context dependent. For example, misophonic responses can be modulated by visual cues. And what I mean by that, if I play you a sound of someone eating chips, for example, and then we have a video, if you were watching a video of someone eating chips, but then I would play you the same sound again, but instead of showing you someone eating chips, someone would be walking on snow, then you'd be likely less triggered when you see someone walking on snow versus someone eating chips. And most importantly, we react less severely to sounds produced by strangers, babies, animals, or even ourselves. So I'm not making this up. There's research that actually supports it a lot, and all the heroes, let's say, well, not all, but most of our heroes in our paper are cited in the paper. So I won't be providing any references here in this talk. And what I'm trying to say is that maybe misophonia is not just about the sound per se. So in this experiment, we want to test two things. One is the ability of listeners to identify a sound, whether actually the ability to identify sound affects the severity of misophonia responses. And number two, the role of spectral and temporal characteristics of sounds in evoking misophonia responses, something which we'll explain later on. So we considered both effects of top-down identification as well as bottom-up auditory processing, auditory attention in terms of spectral information and temporal information. And what I mean by bottom-up processing means that we pay attention to the sound itself. The sound itself shapes our perceptions and have no preconceptions. For example, You just listen to a sound. You don't know if someone's walking on the snow or eating chips. You just feel the sound. And whenever I'll be referring to spectral information, what I mean by that is that the actual frequencies that make up the sound. For example, imagine a piano tone versus, a scratch of nails on a chalkboard. Uh, these two different sounds are made up of different frequencies. And whenever I'll be referring to temporal information, I'll be referring to timing and rhythm of sound bands. For example, the repetitive clicking of a pen versus someone chewing a gum, for example, have different repetitive patterns. Or, for example, someone might be, clicking faster than someone else. So these are all related to timing and rhythm information. And whenever I'll be referring to the top-down processing, which is related to identification, it's called top-down processing because here we use background knowledge and expectations to interpret what we hear. For example, if you live in Greece, as I do, it's very unlikely that you hear someone eating chips and think that he's walking on snow because we don't have much snow here. Whereas if you live in Montreal, for example, then could be that you could say that, oh, he's walking on snow and he's not eating chips. And in terms of action identification, we are mostly interested if listeners can identify the action creating the sound. So we don't want them to describe what the sound is. We want them to describe what created that sound. I'm going to talk a bit about our participants. Without it wouldn't be possible to make this study. So recruitment was done in Prolific. It's a platform from which we can recruit participants. And in total, we had 33 requests, but we were interested in Misophonia participants. And that's why I had a pre-screening questionnaire. And for that purpose, we used the Misophonia Assessment Questionnaire, which you can find online along with a lot of other questionnaires. So we had a threshold and said, okay, you're or misophonic or you claim to be a misophonic participant. So we want to have a score above 22 on the scale of MAC, which indicates moderate misophonia. And if you did have that score, then you'd be invited to our main participant. And so we had to reject a few participants because they didn't have high enough MAC scores for our needs. And then we had some post questionnaires that the participants filled in after the main experiment that are related to the AMISO-S Amsterdam Misophonia Scale and Misophonia coping responses. So this was just for us, to have to be able to test whether our pool of participants were actually misophonic or not, since there are no validated misophonia questionnaires yet. Of course, other questionnaires exist, but that was simple enough for us to filter out participants. And at the end, we had 16 female and 2 male participants, which it's not so strange given what I've heard and learned from past presentations. Female population seems to be more affected by misophonia. But anyway, I'm not an expert in that. The range was about 36 years old, and the mean misophonia assessment questionnaire was about 45, and score above 43 is classified as severe misophonia. And the same goes for the Amsterdam Misophonia Scale. We had a score above 15, which again is classified as severe misophonia. And interestingly, 50% of our participants experienced the ASMR. Now about the stimuli that we used, we recorded stimuli ourselves. We didn't use stimuli found on the internet or from other experiments. The recordings took place at Korsmit, which is the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology. And here you see my colleague Isa and Valentine, who was also an actor, but also a sound engineer. And at the door, you can see that there are no foods or drinks allowed, which is what exactly we want to record. So thanks, Kermit, for giving us permission to do so. Um, so our stimuli consisted of recorded sounds that were either common misophonic triggers, as we know from past literature, or neutral sounds that are not expected to trigger misophonia. And although I do acknowledge that some of our neutral sounds are actually pretty annoying, at least for me, for example, zipper or door creaking. I cannot stand the sounds, but they're not as annoying as a misophonic sound. And what's more, we had to organize all these stimuli into action categories. For example, we had watching all sorts of foods, so that would be categorized, for example, as chewing. And then we have specialists in slurping noodles from China, and we would categorize this action as slurping. So we categorized, we found the categories that were mapped to each stimulus name. And both types of stimuli, misophonic or neutral, were presented in three formats. So they were presented modified, which means as we recorded them, and modified, where we used the signal processing techniques, where the aim was to preserve either their spectral or temporal similarities to the recorded sounds. So, in spectrally modified sounds, we're aiming to present the temporal information, meaning the rhythmic pattern of events. So you can imagine that you had, say, if that was a melody, the notes would occur in the exact same timings. But if the original melody was played by violin, then spectrally modified sounds would be played by piano or something like that. And then the temporal modified the condition, the spectral information was preserved, meaning that, if original recording was made of piano notes, then you would still hear a piano playing, but we would have scrambled all notes. So the temporal information where each note actually occurred was scrambled. And I do admit that it would have been better if I would play you these sounds, some of these sounds, at least the neutral ones, to get a better idea of how this sounds like. I won't do it, or perhaps I'll do it at the very end if I'll have permission, and depending on your comments. But on the top panel here, we see a spectrum. So on the x-axis, we have the time, and on the vertical axis we have the frequency. So you could, if imagine that a click sound, pen clicking sound was recording, then these stripes that you see would correspond to the timing of the clicks. So in the spectral modification, which is in the middle, you see that the stripes, the location of the stripes is preserved, but the seem flattened towards the frequency axis. They seem flatter because we used different frequencies. Actually, we used noise. And again, I'm not going to imitate sound noise for obvious reasons. But on the far end, on the far right, you see the temporal modification, which the clicks are spread all over the place. So we kept the click sound the same, but we graded many more clicks, if I may say so. So in total, we had 78 stimuli of all these three categories with a duration of 10 seconds because we said that, okay, 10 seconds is enough for the stimulus to evoke misophonia responses. And as far as the experimental design is concerned, so participants rated how triggered they were by each sound. So they had the slider, and see it goes from not effective towards very effective. And then we're asked to identify the action category of each sound. We're through the top-down menu that would show up if you would click and show all the options. And these options were our action categories that I showed in the very beginning. Of course, these action categories were randomized per participant. And before going into the main results, our main hypothesis concerns strictly misophonic sounds. So we tested whether the sounds that we thought that we were actually misophonic would have higher aversiveness rating. So on the y-axis, you see the aversiveness rating, and indeed, overall, the sounds that we classified as misophonic on the left panel were rated more aversive compared to our neutral sounds. And what's most obvious from this plot is that the spectral modified sounds were less aversive than both the unmodified and temporally modified sounds. And when I say again spectrally modified sounds, I mean that we kept the timing intact, but we um, changed the spectrum from, a click, we turned to a noisy click, for example, the sound of a lighter. You can imagine something like that. And indeed, this modification reduced the aversiveness rating to a level similar to the neutral sound sets that you see on the right. However, you see in the plot that the unmodified sounds had a higher aversiveness rating compared to the temporal modifications, but statistically speaking, there's no difference at all. And what I mean by statistically speaking, if we had, I don't know, 50 participants, for example, instead of 20, then these differences would diminish. So we don't take this difference as a fact, statistically speaking. So, in conclusion, the temporal modifications did not reduce the aversiveness responses compared to the unmodified stimuli. We keep the spectrum as it was, the same sound, the same timbre, so the same instrument, if you want to make this metaphor, was played exactly the same, but we messed up the notes, their durations, and their onsets. So this didn't reduce the responses. However, the spectral information, when we preserve the exact timing of the notes, while when if you would hear a piano and then the sound was exchanged to something noisy, then this significantly reduced the aversiveness ratings to a level similar to the neutral sets. So we concluded that spectral information is more important than, the temporal information, in the sense that if you're clicking a pen, it doesn't matter how fast or slow you click the pen, as long as it's that distinctive pen sound, for example, that you're clicking. So that was more important. Now, with respect to identification, You see on the y-axis the proportion correct identification, and the unmodified sounds in red were identified almost 100% correctly. One corresponds to 100%. So, okay, this was to be expected. And then the identification fall for temporal sound, temporal modifications, and then for the spectral modifications shown in pinkish. And this, in fact, correlates nicely with the aversiveness ratings that I showed you before. So the original sounds, the unmodified sounds, had the highest aversiveness rating, and the temporal modifications did not reduce the aversiveness ratings that much compared to the original sounds. And then the spectral modifications reduced the proportion correct identification was something like 27%, and they had the lower aversiveness rating. So, as a conclusion, we can say in general that the correctly identified sounds that you see on the left panel were more aversive than the incorrectly identified sounds. But we saw before that the spectral modification, if we preserve, meaning that if we preserve the temporal information while whitening the signal, and I said whitening because we made the pen click as more like a lighter click, like fatter, reduce the aversiveness ratings to a level similar to the neutral sound set. However, if we for those sounds from the spectrally modified sounds that were correctly identified, let's say just correctly identified, you see that the aversiveness ratings were way higher than those that were incorrectly identified. And same goes for properly modified.
I just want to mention we only have 5 minutes, so I'm not sure if you're almost at your conclusion, but we want to have a couple of minutes for people to ask questions.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so correctly identified sounds were rated more aversive than incorrectly identified sounds, and correctly identified identification temporally modified sounds increased the aversiveness ratings, but we saw that overall they were similar to the unmodified sounds, statistically speaking. So this leads to the conclusions that spectral information is more important than temporal formation triggering misophonia. We don't care about the exact timing of events, the repetitive patterns. We care about the sound per se, and that correct identification increased the aversiveness ratings. So both action identification and spectral information play an important role in triggering misophonia. Well, thank you. And here are our emails contacted for the co-authors as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, there are a few questions. So first question is, interesting question actually about comparing humans to other species. This question says that humans, for this person, are so much more triggering than other species. Is there any research about misophonia being triggered by humans as compared to animals, and why and how can our brains filter out triggers which are not from the human species?
No, I'm not aware of that. Sorry. I'm not aware of such research.
Okay. Another question is sound healing, crystal singing bowls tend to be perceived as soothing. These are tuned to 440 hertz. Do you have any ideas about how sound can be used to be helpful? For example, there's a conversation in the chat about utilizing pink noise when someone is speaking to reduce triggers. And can this sound be used as a blocker or distractor or a competitor of sound, or in effect, regulate sounds for misophonia?
Well, some sounds definitely sound more pleasant. I wouldn't focus necessarily on the 440 hertz or whatever hertz is that. Um, but yeah, I guess I'm not sure if that's directly related to misophonia, but uh, the spectrum itself can create modulations in other frequencies that make sounds sound more rough, let's say. However, this could be, just an annoying sound and not necessarily a misophonic sound. So the spectrum, of course, does play a role, and there are soothing sounds. And there's a reason why we say, for example, that pink noise is more smooth in our ears than white noise. But again, I doubt that misophonics are sensitive to these two different types of noise. It's just that white sound is generally more annoying because it triggers higher frequency bands, and pink noise, is more. Uh, it doesn't have so much energy in higher frequencies, so we perceive it as more smooth,
Mm.
so to speak. But I don't see a direct relation to noise because, in fact, if that was the case, we actually used white noise, which was something that I was afraid of for experiments. We could have used pink noise, but we used white noise. But the aversiveness ratings did not increase. So I don't think that misophonia is directly related to the whiteness or pinkiness of noise, whatever other colors of noise.
Okay, final question will be, are there any ear filters that can modify input to be less aversive?
I'm not aware of, but at the time that we're doing this experiment, I used to work in a company where we're making filters for actually earbuds that would filter your voice picked up from inside the ear. So I had the idea that yes, we can identify misophonic sounds, and we can use some sort of filtering technique to mute them or mask them. But then we're running into other problems. It's not actually a problem, it's more about being cost effective. That I don't think that the misophonic sounds are universal. A sound that I find terribly annoying personally doesn't mean that another person will find it equally annoying. For example, some people get triggered by chewing sounds, and some other people get triggered by tapping sounds. So it would have to be pretty personalized, and I don't know if the industry is willing to take that step. Yeah.
All right. Well,
thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk today, and thank you all for the participation in the chat.
Thank you.